So hi everybody, welcome to our second webinar on ways to increase biodiversity. Today we're really lucky to have Mike with us, who's going to tell us all about ponds and how good ponds are for increasing biodiversity. We are always really enthusiastic about projects who want to include ponds as part of their work because they really are a great way of helping nature. So Mike is going to take us through his presentation, and then at the end there'd be time for questions. If you want to ask Mike anything about ponds or things that you're thinking of doing, he'd be very happy to answer them. And then just to say, you're also always welcome to email me about a grant application if you're thinking of applying to the Community Green Grants. I will put in my email in the chat, and then afterwards, after the webinar, if you want to email me and set up a one-to-one, we can chat through your project idea, which we're always really happy to do. So I'm going to hand you over to Mike now, and I might just have to let people in as you go, Mike. So apologise if I interrupt to ask people to mute occasionally. It might just have to be a reminder.
That's brilliant. Well, look, thank you. I'll just load up and we can get rolling. So just let me know when you can see the screen, please, Ruth.
Yeah, I can see it.
Right, okay, well, good morning. Thanks for joining us today. Really, what I wanted to talk about is around pond creation, because ponds are absolutely amazing habitats, because they're relatively easy to create, and no matter how big or small they are, they provide a self-sustaining ecosystem that increases biodiversity of the area and actually attracts a lot of variety to a space. So you get an awful lot of value for space. I'm not going to say value for money, but within a small space, you get an awful lot of biodiversity value. So they're a really great thing to incorporate into any kind of community space or even your garden. So why are they important? Let's start off with the reasons behind why they're important. So if you think about fresh water in the UK, you've got rivers, you've got lakes, you've got ponds. Yet ponds support 2/3 of the UK's invertebrate species, freshwater invertebrate species. And a good pond can have as many as 100 different species of freshwater invertebrates. So it just shows the level of complexity of the habitat. All of the UK amphibian species rely upon ponds for their breeding cycle. So without ponds, you wouldn't have frogs, you wouldn't have newts, you wouldn't have toads. So absolutely critical for that group of animals. It's recognised as a UK priority habitat. So that puts it right up there with ancient woodland and sand dunes, those kind of habitats. It really is recognised as being very important. It's also supports 80 of the UK priority species. So these are the animals and the plants that are considered to be of critical value in the UK. So again, ponds are important for those. At the local level, ponds as a habitat are recognised as a priority habitat in the Birmingham and Black Country and Warwickshire biodiversity action plans. And in both of those action plans, they're identified as supporting great crested newt. Now, if you look in the bottom left there, that's actually my pet amphibian. I call him Tiny because he's my newt. So I'm glad you're on mute because it'll cover up the laughter. So what's really quite alarming to us is the loss of ponds, however. We've lost about half of our farm ponds in the last 50 years, and to a certain degree this may be a little bit down to changes in how cattle are put out to pasture. Historically, there would have been a pond in every field boundary where the cattle can go and take water. Nowadays, we have piped water and those kind of things. Ponds have been left, they've been neglected, they've dried out. And that loss then impacts upon all those important species we've talked about above. So there's loads of guidance out there, and this kind of reflects the recognised importance of ponds as a habitat. All of these organisations have various sets of guidelines that you can use to create, in essence, garden ponds or small ponds in the landscape. So if you go onto the websites of any of these guys, you'll see some really good illustrative guidelines to help you through the process. So the key things I'm going to talk about today are siting, where to put your pond, how to excavate, the lining of the pond to keep the water in place, planting it up, and then water problems, and then what's likely to happen in terms of colonisation. So in terms of siting, the obvious thing, water has a bad habit of flowing downhill, so the pond itself needs to be level. It can be set in a landscape where you've got slopes or banks around it, but the pond itself does need to be level, otherwise the water's going to go somewhere else down the slope. Before you dig anything, just do a sense check for services, and what I mean by services are things like pipes, sewers, electricity cables, internet cables, those kind of things. It's normally pretty obvious where these things are, but just have a think about it before you start to break the ground. The reality is you're not going to be using big excavators, so it's not much of an issue. If you're using hand tools, you're not going to cause any great damage through that if you find something. Have a think about whether you're going to cause any ecological damage by creating a new habitat. So just have a think, is the ground potentially providing a service for other species or habitats? Avoiding shade's a good idea. Now, some shade, which might be for part of the day, is not a bad thing actually, because it regulates temperature. But if you're completely shaded by trees or buildings, it's not a good thing for a pond. And you see the picture on the right there. This is a woodland pond that suffers with shading, and you've got no aquatic plants in there at all due to the shading. You also get a heavy drop of leaf litter that just clogs it up, and you get this kind of sludge around the edge, and it's a loss. It's a loss of habitat and potential. Ideally, you want to have nearby clean water input, and what I mean by that is the ability to top up your pond from, say, a rainwater butt in cases of drought and an emergency there. So that's the clean water I'd be wanting to see into your pond. Think about runoff and pollution. If you buy a car park or a road, the kind of stuff that comes off there, you'll have oils, you'll have grits, you'll have all sorts of muck coming into your pond. So you want to make sure you're not going to get pollution from off-site. Public safety. Have you got small children, toddlers walking about? Just need to think about that safety element, whether you need a small barrier or something, just to keep it safe. And then on the flip side of the public is whether you're going to get interference. Could you end up having McDonald's wrappers thrown in, or shopping trolleys, or whatever? Is it in a place that could be vulnerable to unsociable behaviour? So that's all about siting. So once you've got your site, you need to think about excavation. And the best thing to do is have a really good think about what you want to achieve with this. So you need to mark it out, get it marked out on the ground with canes, with a rope, with whatever you want to do. Just get a feel for the outline of what you want to create, and have a 3D vision. So you need to think about how deep it's going to be, where the deep bit is, where the benches are going to be, the shallows, and kind of try and imagine that. And it's really difficult once you get digging to actually see that on the ground. So what I've tended to find is when I've got my vision of where a bench is or the base, I tend to exaggerate the excavation, because by the time you've got a liner in, it kind of gets smoothed down. So I tend to find, yeah, dig the hole and dig it a little bit bigger than what you think it should be. Don't go mad. In this case, I've dug quite a deep pond here, about 80 centimetres. So that's a deep one. You only really need to go 50 centimetres or so for a wildlife pond. But what I would say is try and make sure you have got benches, so you've got shallows and you've got a deep bit. And on the edges, try not to slope it in too much, because you'll have an awful lot of liner showing on those edges when the water's going up and down. Have a think about where all that soil is going to go. You will generate a big heap of soil, and that needs to go somewhere. So that might be a raised bed project. That might be somewhere you can create other garden landscaping projects and utilize that material. Think about the weather. Check it's not going to rain as soon as you start digging, because what you don't want to do is create a muddy hollow that is just impossible to excavate from. It needs to be dry to get your liner in and to form the shape. And be realistic, it's really hard work. Once you get started, you can't turn back. So make sure you've got enough people, you've got the tools, you've got the energy to actually see it through in that weather window that you've got. Now, if you look to the right, there's a really strange picture of some sort of turfs lifted up. Now, what I tend to do with my ponds is I will cut a turf where the edge is and roll it back. And by rolling it back, I can put the liner underneath and then drop the turf back on. And if you look at the image in the bottom right, you can see what happens when you drop that turf over the edge. When the pond fills up, it creates a really naturalistic kind of pond feature. And it looks a lot better. It integrates the marginal species a lot better. And it may get over any slight glitches you might have with it being level or not in the perfect world. It's never going to be perfect. So that does help things and helps get your pond established. So that's my top tip for excavation. Now, in terms of lining, loads of different ways you can do this. So you can have a pre-formed rigid pond liner, which is like a big plastic tub, and to a certain degree those are great because they do all the thinking for you in terms of size and benches and depth. So they're great because all you need to do is get them in place, and they're long lasting and they're more resistant to punctures or leaks. They're a lot tougher than flexible liners. You can be innovative. You can use a bucket. You can sink a bucket. You can sink a Belfast sink or a bathtub. You can use things like that. Make sure you put the plug in, but you can use things like that. They will create a pond and maybe even a talking point, which is great. And then you can use flexible liners that give you much more scope to design the shape and the form as you want it to be. And these can be butyl, like a kind of rubbery black sheet, or a PVC. And what I've used in this instance is a really lightweight PVC that's almost like a heavy duty tarpaulin, comes with a 20-year guarantee. And it looks, when I've laid it out on the right there, you can see it's really wrinkled. Don't worry about that, because when the water's in, the water will press all that down. Those wrinkles will be pushed down. They will be barely visible. But underneath that, I've got the white fleece, which is an underlayer, which makes sure there's a bit of padding under the liner, so any stones or sharp bits are going to be insulated and are unlikely to puncture. So that's quite important. You could use a bit of old carpet underlay. And when it comes to shape and the actual form of the pond, you'll see in the bottom left there, I've created some beaches, and I've used pebbles. I bought one sack, which is only, I think, about 10 kilos of landscaping pebbles, which is probably only about a quarter of what you see there. And all the other pebbles are out of the earth I excavated for the pond. I put them aside, I've washed them, and then I've incorporated them back into the design to create a bench. And it's really important that when you design your pond, you've got some shallows so that if any animals fall in, hedgehogs, for example, they've got an escape route. They can get to the edge, they can climb out. It's also a great place for invertebrates to establish and hide and find a little niche, and for some of the smaller aquatic plants to actually get themselves established. Now, in terms of sizing, when you're buying a liner, you will find on most of the supply websites, there's a little calculation chart. But in essence, if your pond is 2 meters by 5 meters, you have to buy a liner that is much bigger than that, because when you press it down in the middle, it's going to pull in. So your 2 meters by 5 meters, if it's half a meter deep, might actually need to be 3 meters by 7 meters or something like that. So bear in mind the dimensions of the pond will be smaller than the dimensions of the liner. You need to have a bigger liner. So just bear that in mind. And in terms of fitting, what I tended to do is you've got the underlay, and then you put the liner in, start in the deep bit, and then kind of work it out. Pad it out. You're going to have areas where you need to fold to get round corners. And what I've talked about earlier is the overlap, using the turf to anchor it and to form a bit of a ridge, a bank around the edge. In terms of planting, there are 3 zones that are frequently talked about when you look at the plants in a pond system. And what's really important is you get some oxygenators, and these typically are plants that live in the deeper water, and they have a fairly big structure of plant material beneath the surface. So in this case, my oxygenators, I've gone for fairly delicate small species. So I've gone for starwort, which grows really well, and I've gone for mare's tail. That's not horsetail, it's mare's tail, which is Hippurus. That's a pond plant. So they're good oxygenators, and they're good for keeping the condition of the water suitable for your biodiversity, your bugs, your amphibians, and keeping it clear. You've then got the next zone of emergent plants, and emergent plants are those that like their toes to be in the water, but equally, most emergent plants are quite comfortable being on the margins and actually in very wet marginal bankside vegetation. So these are really, really flexible plants. So I've got water mint, water forget-me-not, water plantain, and monkey flower. Monkey flower is the little yellow one on the bottom there. It's beautiful, really great plant. Can go in shallow water, 6 inches, or even on the banks. And then marginal is where you're right on the banks, or maybe just slightly damp ground on the edges. You've got yellow flag iris, and you've got meadowsweet. Meadowsweet is a beautiful one because it's got a really strong odor, a really sweet odor, hence the name. Now the photos on the right are kind of a few more tips to think about. So the top right is my way of dealing with bought aquatic plants that come in plastic pots. So when you buy an aquatic plant from a garden centre, they will come in a pot, and like most plants, you need to repot and resize them as they grow. What you will find with a plastic pot is they're generally small. You get a lot of plant growth above. They're quite unstable in that pond setting, so they can blow over, and you're gonna have to go in, pull them out, and repot them at some point. So my solution to this, to give it a more naturalistic feel, is to repot them in a piece of hessian or material, natural material that will biodegrade over time. So this is a bit of sacking that's been wet for a week, and you can see already with a bit of additional aquatic compost, it's rooted, it's already establishing, and it's a much more stable base for that plant to establish itself in the pond. So that's my top tip for planting plants in your pond. Bottom right, you can see there you've got 2 plant species, really attractive pond species, but they've gone absolutely mad in this pond. And what I would say is, if you've got a small pond, think really carefully about what you're planting. As a rule of thumb, if the leaves are bigger than your fist, they're probably going to become quite aggressive and dominating in that pond setting. And if it grows higher than your waist, again, it's going to be a species that spreads and grows and can be quite dominant. So try and keep your plants in a more delicate form. So all of those plants I've identified on this sheet are quite well formed. They don't go mad, and if they do expand, you can usually pull off side shoots and manage them a little bit so they don't over dominate the pond itself. And around the pond, really important, you think about other habitats, because if you're going to bring biodiversity into this, you need to think about the other complementary habitats. So amphibians, for example, those amphibians for which ponds are important, when they're adults, they only return to the pond and the water for some seasonal romancing. It's just there for their breeding cycle. The rest of the time they're on land, so they need areas of shelter, they need areas to get food. So on the left we've got a little bit of marsh on the edge of the pond. That's great. So we've got meadowsweet and yellow flag. You can leave bits of grass uncut beside your pond or nearby, and that's going to be good for bugs. It's going to be good for beetles and spiders, which are good food for amphibians. But it's also going to have other benefits, because you're going to get flowering plants, you're going to get pollinators there, which are really good for biodiversity in general. And then on the right, this is a tatty little pile of sticks and twigs and logs. We'd call it a habitat pile or even a hibernacular. So those amphibian species will be looking for places to shelter, and a log pile or a hibernacular is a really good feature for them, because when it gets hot and dry, they can crawl under there, they can stay cool, they can stay damp. They have to stay cool and damp ideally, and it's a good place for food as well for them. They love those kind of bugs that scrabble around in rotting vegetation. Now, we all have problems with our water at times, so there's a few things to think about here when you're establishing your pond, and topping up is one of them. In the ideal world, we wouldn't need to top up, but we've seen of late it hasn't rained an awful lot. I created a pond on the Queen's Jubilee and it hasn't filled up yet. I've been topping it up with water butts as much as I can. My wife's going mad, she can't water the garden. So you can see the conflict here, but ideally top up with rainwater from roof collected rain butts. If you get really desperate, use tap water, but ideally not. It's just not the done thing because it's treated. If your pond is going to dry out completely, yeah, get some tap water in there just to keep it surviving, keep those plants. You don't want them dying off, because that's the foundation of your ecosystem. So think about runoff as well. Now, the top right, you'll see looks like a murky puddle, and the idiot who built this pond dug out and very diligently placed all the excavated soil on a piece of tarpaulin to the side, and then it rained and loads of it washed back in. So that was a bit of an idiotic thing to do, but think about it. If you've got bare soil nearby, it's going to flush in if you get a rain event. So think about runoff and what can come back into your pond. Blanket weed is a form of algae, and it will happen in most ponds to a greater or lesser degree. You can't really help it. It's helped a little if you've got oxygenators. They will help the process, but once you've got blanket weed, it will grow over a matter of days like big green candy floss, and it will sap the oxygen from the pond. So the best thing to do there, and it's a really good therapy actually, is get a bamboo cane, stick it in and twizzle it like you get in candy floss, and it's really, really satisfying because it will stick and it will whirl around the cane. You can hoik it out and make sure anything you pull out of the pond is put on the bank, albeit for half a day, so any bugs in there can make their way back into the pond. And fish, please do not introduce fish. They are absolute terrors for eating what you put in there. They'll disturb the substrates. They'll either eat plant material, which you don't want, or they're going to eat your bugs and your amphibians, and they will decimate a pond. They might be great to look at, but they're not good for amphibians. Great crested newts, for example, when they're in their larval stage, when they're tadpoles, for want of a better phrase, we call newt tadpoles efts. They've got a bad habit of just kind of drifting like that in mid-water columns, so they become fish food. So fish and wildlife, they don't really go together, so keep them apart, please. And finally, what's going to happen when you build your pond? I'm going to go back to that great philosopher, Kevin Costner, who once said, build it and they will come. So, and that's absolutely true. If you get a pond, a hole that's filled with water, with a few plants in there, you will find it amazing how quickly pond life will appear. So here we've got damselflies, we've got a great diving beetle at the bottom there. They're ferocious, they're massive. They're a big old beetle. You've got toads, frogs, great crested newts. That's a female there in the hand. And of course, they are absolutely brilliant for kids as well as and adults. You know, I think when a pond is buzzing with wildlife, be it invertebrates or amphibians, it's just a great thing to sit by and watch what's going on. If you're really lucky, you may get grass snake too. Grass snake was actually called the water snake in Victorian times because they are brilliant swimmers and their main prey items are actually amphibians. So if you do have grass snake, it means you've got a good healthy population of amphibians. So ponds really do, for a small amount of effort and space, they really do give you a lot back in terms of biodiversity. They're big hitters, they're really important, and they're good value for providing biodiversity gain. So hope that's given you a good flavour as to how to do it and what you might get. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Oh, thanks, Mike. That was so interesting and really, really informative. It's really great. Thanks a lot. I'm going to stop recording now, and we can go to questions. So just to let you know, I will be sending you out Mike's slides, and there will be a recording of this on YouTube as well. But now